The morning I collapsed on the kitchen floor, I was 7 months pregnant, and I had not kept water down in 4 days. I remember the exact sound the wooden boards made when my knees hit them. I remember the smell of cold ash in the stove that I had not yet lit, because I could not stand long enough to light it. I remember hearing Eli's boots on the porch steps outside, the heavy, even rhythm of a man walking toward the barn, away from the house, away from me, the way he walked every morning, the way he had walked every morning of our marriage, the way he would walk tomorrow morning and the morning after that, as if everything inside these walls was already handled, already fine, already not his concern. I lay on my side on that floor with my cheek against the cold wood, and I listened to his footsteps fade, and I counted the sounds I could hear. The wind against the east window, the baby in the cradle upstairs beginning to stir, the distant low of a cow from the barn. I counted every sound in that house, every sound on that farm, every sound in the gray morning air around me, and the sound of someone coming to help was not among them. I want to tell you who I am before I tell you what happened next. My name is Clara. I was raised Old Order Amish in a small settlement in central Pennsylvania, the third daughter of a farming family, where the women rose before the sun and went to bed after everyone else and never once named that as a sacrifice. I married Eli when I was 20 years old. I was 23 when I lay on that kitchen floor. And I am here now, older and outside, telling you the thing that my community spent years making sure I would never say out loud. If this is the kind of story you have been waiting to hear, the kind that lives underneath the quiet surface of plain life, please subscribe to Amish Clara and tap the like button so more people can find their way here. And tell me in the comments, did anyone ever tell you that your suffering was yours alone to manage? Because I was told that every day of my life, and I did not even have the words to know it was happening. Now I need you to understand something about the way pregnancy worked inside my community before I can explain what was done to me and what was not done, and why those two things were, in the end, the same injury. Pregnancy in our settlement was not a medical event. It was not a household event. It was a woman's season, and it belonged to her the way the kitchen belonged to her, and the garden belonged to her, and the laundry belonged to her. It was her domain, which is another way of saying it was her problem. There were no prenatal appointments with doctors. There was a midwife who came when she was called, and sometimes when she thought to come and sometimes not at all, if the roads were bad or the season was busy. There was no conversation from the pulpit about what a husband owed his pregnant wife, because the assumption underneath everything was that he owed her nothing specific, only the general faithfulness of providing a house and food and the spiritual covering of his headship. What happened inside her body during the 9 months she carried his child was, in the most literal sense, not his problem. That phrase, not the husband's problem, was never said directly to me. It didn't need to be. It was the water I swam in. It was the shape of every conversation I had ever witnessed between married women, the way they spoke about their pregnancies in the past tense, as something survived, as weather endured, never as something their husbands had shared with them or helped carry. I absorbed this the way I absorbed everything in my community, not through teaching but through the 1,000 small silences that teach better than any sermon. I married Eli in the spring of my 20th year. He was 24, the eldest son of a large family from a neighboring district, a man with steady hands and a reputation for fair dealing and a quietness that everyone around us called a virtue. He was not cruel. I want to say that clearly and early, because the story I am about to tell you is not a story about a cruel man. It is a story about something more complicated than cruelty, something that has no villain and no hero, and yet somehow produces tremendous damage all the same. Eli was a man who had been taught, from the first breath of his life, exactly where his responsibilities ended. And they ended at the threshold of my body. The sickness started in my 3rd month. I had been sick with my first pregnancy too, but nothing like this. This was a different creature entirely. This was waking at 2 a.m. to retch into a bucket, and then lying on the bathroom floor until 4 because the cold tile was the only thing that slowed the spinning. This was losing 8 pounds in 6 weeks when I should have been gaining. This was a midwife who came, pressed her hands to my abdomen, listened to the heartbeat, nodded her approval at the baby's position, and prepared to leave without once asking how I was managing. I stopped her at the door. I asked her if this level of sickness was normal. She said some women carry hard. She said it with the particular gentleness of someone delivering a sentence that means you are on your own now. And she left. That evening I told Eli I was too sick to make supper. I said it plainly, without drama, the way you report a fact. I said, "Eli, I cannot stand at the stove tonight. I am too ill." He looked at me with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between concern and inconvenience, and he went to the bread box and cut himself several slices and ate them standing at the counter. He did not ask if I had eaten. He did not ask what I needed. He did not ask how long I had been feeling this way, or whether the midwife had said anything, or whether there was anything at all he could do. He finished his bread, he washed his hands, and he went to bed. I stood in that kitchen for a long time after he left. Then I went to the floor, because the cool wood felt better than anything else in my body's vocabulary of terrible options, and I lay there in the dark with my hands folded over my stomach, and I listened to the house breathe around me. And I thought, with a kind of hollow calmness that I now recognize as a woman's mind protecting itself from something too large to feel all at once, I thought, if I stopped breathing tonight, the first person to notice would be whoever came in the morning to start the fire. 3 days after that night on the floor, Eli's mother came. Her name was Rebecca, and she was a woman I respected deeply, a woman who had raised 7 children and kept an immaculate house, and never once, in all the years I had known her, said a word that could be called unkind. She arrived in the morning with a pot of chicken soup wrapped in towels to keep it warm, and she set it on my stove, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table, and she watched me with the careful measuring eyes of a woman taking inventory. I waited for her to ask how I was. I waited for her to say something about the shadows under my eyes, or the way my dress hung differently now, or the fact that her son had apparently said nothing to her about the state of his wife. She watched me for a long moment, and then she said with great warmth and great conviction, "The Lord gives a woman what she can carry." I nodded. I waited. There was no more. She ladled soup into a bowl for me, and she talked about her garden, and the neighbor's new barn roof, and a letter she had received from a cousin in Indiana, and she left an hour later with her empty pot, and the door closed behind her, and I sat at that table with the soup growing cold in front of me, and I understood something that I did not yet have the language to name. She had not come to help me. She had come to deliver a theological verdict. The verdict was that I was fine because God had decided I was fine, and therefore the matter was settled. This is the thing about the community of women I grew up inside. They were not absent. They were not cold, not in any way they would have recognized as cold. They came. They brought food. They sat with you. But they brought something else alongside the food that I can only describe as a framework. A pre-assembled understanding of your suffering that arrived before you could even describe the suffering yourself. And that framework meant that your actual experience, the specific terrible details of what was happening to your body, never quite had to be heard. Because it had already been categorized. It was a woman's season. It was her cross. It was the Lord's refinement of her character. And a woman who bore it well was a woman of faith, and a woman who struggled visibly was a woman who needed to pray more and trust more and ask less. I went to the quilting circle in my 6th month because I could not afford the kind of absence that would be noticed and discussed. I was barely able to sit upright on the bench. I held my needle and I tried to keep my hands steady, and I listened to the women talk. At some point, a woman named Sadie began speaking about a young wife 2 settlements over who had, in Sadie's words, made her pregnancy the whole household's burden. Who had asked her husband to take on tasks that were not his to take on. Who had, and Sadie said this with a gentle shaking of her head, forgotten that a man has his own work and his own tiredness, and cannot be expected to carry what God designed a woman to carry herself. The room murmured in agreement. No one looked at me. Everyone was looking at me. I kept my eyes on my needle and my thread, and I pressed my lips together, and I thought about the floor. I thought about the cold wood under my cheek. I thought about Eli's boots walking away, and I thought, they know. They all know. And they have already decided what it means. I began watching Eli during those months the way you watch something you are trying to understand before it is too late to understand it. Not with anger, not yet. With something more like scientific curiosity, the kind that keeps emotion at a careful distance because emotion would make it impossible to see clearly. I watched the way he spoke to his horses, with a patience and a gentleness that was genuine, that was not performed. I watched the way he stopped to help a neighbor whose wagon wheel had cracked in the lane outside our house, how he spent 2 hours in the cold without being asked, without hesitation. I watched him at church suppers, how he listened carefully when the older men spoke, how he never interrupted, how he carried heavy things for women who were not his wife. He was not a man without tenderness. That was the part that was hardest to carry. He was a man whose tenderness had borders, and those borders had been drawn by something much larger and older than either of us, and he had never once been asked to notice where they fell. One night, very late, in the 7th month, I asked him directly. I waited until the children were asleep and the house was quiet, and I sat across from him at the kitchen table and I said, "Eli, do you know how sick I have been?" He looked up from the harness strap he was mending. He looked at me for a long moment with those steady, unreadable eyes. And then he said, "You're still here, aren't you?" He meant it as comfort. I understood, even in that moment, that he meant it as evidence of my strength, as a kind of affirmation. You survived, therefore you were strong enough, therefore everything was as it should be. He went back to his mending. I sat with that sentence in my chest, like a stone, and I felt something shift inside me, not dramatically, not with any noise, just a quiet tectonic movement, the way the ground shifts before anything visible changes on the surface. I decided that night that I needed to find out if anyone at all inside the boundaries of my known world, could see what I was beginning to see. And there was one woman I thought might. Her name was Anna. She was 61 years old, and she had lived her entire life inside our settlement, and she had lost 2 pregnancies, both late, both after months of serious illness, and she had never spoken about either of them publicly. In our community, she was known as a private woman, which was our way of describing someone who had survived something that no one had ever thought to ask about. She lived half a mile from us, in a house she kept alone since her husband's death 3 years prior, and she had a quality about her that I can only describe as stillness, not the stillness of someone who has nothing to say, but the stillness of someone who has decided very carefully what they will and will not spend their words on. She came to my house on a Wednesday morning in my 8th month. She brought nothing. No soup, no bread, no casserole wrapped in cloth. She knocked, she came in when I opened the door, she sat down at my kitchen table, and she looked at me across the wood with clear, direct eyes, and she said, "Tell me what it has actually been like." I had not been asked that question, not once. Not by the midwife, not by Rebecca, not by my own mother, who had visited twice, and both times spoken primarily about the baby's position, and the baby's likely size, and the baby's future, and the baby's needs. Not by any of the women who had come with their soup and their scripture. Not by Eli. No one had asked me what it had actually been like. I opened my mouth to answer, and instead I began to cry. Not gently, not quietly, but the kind of crying that comes from somewhere so far down that it frightens you when it arrives, the kind that sounds like something being released that has been held under pressure for a very long time. Anna did not move toward me. She did not reach across the table. She simply waited with the patience of someone who has learned that there are kinds of pain that need to come out before they can be spoken about, and that the worst thing you can do is try to stop them. When I could speak, I told her everything. I told her about the floor. I told her about the cold bread. I told her about the midwife's expression at the door. I told her about Rebecca's theological verdict and Sadie's quilting circle speech and the 8 pounds I had lost and the nights I lay awake wondering what would happen to my children if something went wrong inside my body in the dark and no one came until morning. I told her about Eli's sentence. "You're still here, aren't you?" and the way I had felt the ground move under me when he said it. Anna listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she told me about her own pregnancies. She told me about the first one, the illness that started at 2 months and did not stop, the weight she lost, the way she lay on the floor of her own kitchen while her husband ate cold bread at the counter. She told me about asking for help and being given the same theological framework I had been given. She told me about the second pregnancy, how she already knew by then not to ask, how she had moved through 9 months of suffering in a kind of determined silence, and how the baby had come too early anyway, and how she had lain in her bed afterward with empty arms and listened to her husband tell the bishop that she was recovering well. She did not cry while she told me this. She had, I understood, finished her crying a long time ago. She spoke the way someone speaks when they have decided that the truth is worth more than the protection of silence. And then she said the thing that rearranged the furniture of my entire understanding. She did not use outside words, clinical words, the kind my therapist would give me years later. She used plain words, Amish words, the only words available to both of us in that kitchen. She said, "A husband who will not see your suffering is not a steady man. He is a man who has learned that your suffering is not required of him. And that is not God's design, Clara. That is a man's convenience dressed in God's clothing. There is a difference. There has always been a difference. We were just never given permission to say it." I drove home that afternoon, and I want to tell you that I went home and I confronted Eli with everything Anna had said, and that something changed between us, loudly and permanently, the way things change in stories. That is not what happened. What happened is that I went home and I made supper and I bathed the children, and I lay down beside Eli in the dark and I stared at the ceiling and I felt the ground that had shifted weeks ago shift again, this time in a direction I could almost name. Something had changed in the architecture of how I understood my life. Not loudly, not with any announcement, but the way you notice, after a very long time in a dim room, that light has been coming through a crack all along and you simply had not let yourself look at it directly. I began noticing things I had always seen but never examined. The way every decision in our household moved through Eli without pausing to consider what I thought. The way my exhaustion was acknowledged in principle and ignored in practice. The way the women around me had built entire interior lives around the management of being unseen, had become so skilled at it that they mistook the skill for contentment. I was still sick. I was still pregnant. But I was no longer alone inside my own understanding, and that changed everything, the way a single door opening in a closed house changes the quality of all the air inside it. The baby came in the deep cold of February. Eli was not in the room because that was not our custom. I was surrounded by the midwife and 2 women from the community who had attended many births, and who were skilled and efficient and kind in the particular way of people who have done a hard thing so many times that they have learned to do it without flinching. They spoke to me steadily. They told me what was happening and what was coming and what I needed to do. They were, in the only way our community knew how to offer it, present with me. The baby was a girl. She came into the world loud and certain, with a full head of dark hair and a fury about her that made the midwife laugh. I held her against my chest and I felt, underneath the exhaustion and the relief and the enormous animal love of it, something quieter and more private. A decision forming, not a dramatic one, not one I could have explained in words yet. Just the bone-deep knowledge that I was holding a person who had not yet been told what her suffering would and would not be allowed to cost other people. And I thought, I will not be the one to tell her that. I will not pass that particular inheritance forward. Whatever else I give her, I will not give her that. I left our community 2 years after that February morning. That is a different story for a different time, and it carried its own enormous weight of loss and shunning, and the particular grief of walking away from the only world you have ever known. But the leaving began, I understand now, in Anna's kitchen on a Wednesday morning when a woman with clear eyes and no soup and no scripture sat across from me and asked the question no one else had thought to ask. It began the moment someone said, "Tell me what it has actually been like." If you have ever been sick and been told that your sickness was yours alone to carry, I see you. If you have ever needed someone to come towards you and been given theology instead of presence, I see you. If you have ever loved a person who was not cruel but who had simply never been asked to see your suffering as his concern, I see you. You were not too much. You were not failing to carry what God designed you to carry. You were a person in a system that had decided, long before you arrived, exactly how much of you it was willing to see. And if there is an Anna in your life, a woman who comes without soup and without scripture, and asks the true question, hold on to her. She is rarer than anything. She was the reason I knew what I was finally walking toward when I walked. Your suffering was always the household's business. It was always everyone's concern. The only thing that was never true was the silence that told you otherwise. If this story reached something inside you, tell me in the comments. Tell me if you were ever sick and invisible at the same time. Tell me if you had someone who finally asked the real question. And if you want to keep hearing the stories that were never meant to leave the kitchen, subscribe to Amish Clara. There is so much more that still needs to be said. Until next time, remember this. A woman's pain does not become smaller because no one looked at it. It only becomes lonelier. And lonelier was never the same thing as fine.